while every Fire Emblem game takes a completely different path and narrative to get there, all of them more or less end the same way. We, the protagonists, have won and are now heroes of legend, roll credits. But while every single title in the series ends like this, there are also a few games that have alternate endings, although putting it like that makes it sound as if our choices matter and there are different solutions to the main conflicts when that really isn't the case. Instead, there are a few Fire Emblem games where it's possible to fill not just an individual chapter, but your entire journey, causing the villains to win and the heroes to lose. Depending on how broadly you define a bad ending, you could even make the argument that bad endings have existed in the series for as long as it has been around. Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light has a different epilogue depending on whether Shida survives or not. The difference isn't huge, we're talking 4 lines here, but it's made grander in the DS remake, to the point you can honestly kinda consider that a proper bad ending, as it definitely adds an entire blanket of sadness over your victory over Medeus. In the NES original, it feels more like the game acknowledging you lost a unit. On the DS, the effect it has on Marv as a person is much more tangible. You could even make the argument that it changes the story of the game beyond just the death of Shida. As Nina implies, her death means she is the victim of the Fire Emblem's curse, rather than Nina, who could be considered the canon victim, judging by how she suffers in both Shadow Dragon and Mystery of the Emblem. And speaking of mystery, this one certainly has a bad ending, no ifs, ands or buts about it. Early on in the game, Marv received the Binding Shield and is tasked with restoring it, which requires the Fire Emblem, a mandatory item, as well as the Light, Dark, Geo, Life and Star Spheres, which can be collected throughout the game. And I say can be deliberately, because all except for the Light Sphere and Dark Sphere can certainly be missed. The first of these two is automatically given to you by Goto, the other is always dropped by Hardin when he's defeated. The other 3 spheres though are factually optional. The Life Sphere is given to Marv by the King of Aurelis in chapter 18, but only if you visit his village. The Geosphere is held by a thief in chapter 16, who, unlike Hardin, is not mandatory to be defeated, and the Star Sphere is a big one. This orb is also given to you by Goto, but in order to actually receive it, you have to collect all 12 astral shards, required to complete the Star Sphere in the first place. And these shards, just like the spheres themselves, are very much missable. That said, it's not likely that you fail to collect all of these spheres. The game tells you well in advance you need to start collecting, and I don't think any of the long list of required items is an absolute nightmare to collect. I think that if you play Mystery the way you normally would, you're likely to collect them all. And that's a good thing, because the final chapter, and in New Mystery an additional paralogue, are locked away if you don't complete the Binding Shield. At the end of chapter 20, the group celebrates their victory as if it's all over. Then they are approached by their kidnapped loved ones, so Elise, Nina, Maria and Lena. If you didn't complete the Binding Shield, you are thanked by the kidnapped maidens, who mention that they worked together to defeat Garnev and save the day. The end. So, how is this a bad ending again? It sounds like the game just ends sooner without even more bloodshed. I don't see how that is a bad thing. Well, here's the kicker. This isn't actually the kidnapped maidens. It's Garnev and his lackeys in disguise, and if you have the Binding Shield, that illusion is shattered, and thus the story continues without Marv and the rest of his crew under the impression they have saved the day when they actually haven't. It's an interesting way to do a bad ending, as it doesn't feel like anything disastrous has happened whatsoever. The game makes only very slight hints that this is not ideal and then just rolls the credits, without acknowledging what actually happened with the world, which is definitely not good. I can imagine that if you were a Japanese player all the way back in 1994, going through a replay of the game after initially failing to get all spheres, and now finally doing it, your mind is absolutely blown that the game continues, and that the ending you thought was intended, if perhaps a little underwhelming, is actually not the end at all. On the other hand, you could make the argument that if the game really wanted to succeed at its goal, which presumably was to encourage multiple playthroughs and improve replayability, it should have made it a little bit more obvious that this was actually a bad ending. I mean, it's so hard to say in a world where we all know how Mystery ends and how every game seems to end with a fight against some sort of monster dragon, but this ending truly only has some minor hints that it's not the true end. I genuinely don't even know if I would recognize this was not the actual end. I would probably just think it was an underwhelming and disappointing ending, but not necessarily question it. I mean, we're in chapter 20, it's not like we've just played a shortened game or something. All in all, while not perfect and not as cool and elaborate as it could have been, I'd still say Mystery of the Emblem's bad ending is neat. It's a fun addition that doesn't really hurt anyone. The bad ending of the Binding Blade though. Good lord man, this is like the developers looked at what Mystery did and thought, you know what, we can do that again. And we'll make it 100 times worse. Literally everything about this bad ending is just not good. Let's start by how you even get it, or rather, you are supposed to avoid it. Just like in Mystery, you're tasked with collecting the necessary MacGuffins, in this case, the legendary weapons of a leap. While they're not as high in numbers as the spheres, astral shards included, the way to get them is much worse. Only 3 of 9 are guaranteed to become yours through story means, the rest is obtainable via paralogs. And that may not sound super bad if you're familiar with today's Fire Emblem games, where paralogs automatically appear and are then to be played whenever you want. But back in the old days, you could only do those bonus chapters immediately after their connected main chapter, and only if you had completed some arbitrary turn count by the end of it. A turn count the game doesn't tell you about. Now, sure, some of those turn counts are very forgiving and you're likely to meet the requirements for the paralogs even if you're playing blind and normally. But others, they're quite strict, especially if you don't know about them. I mean, Binding Blade is one of the hardest Fire Emblem games on normal difficulty. It's not a cakewalk, so I would not be surprised in the slightest if the majority of first-timers failed to collect all legendary weapons. I mean, my first time playing, I had been warned thrice over by the internet to make sure to collect all legendary weapons and I still failed. Yoder died in a nightmare that is chapter 21 before I could remove Maltad from his inventory. Oh, and I didn't see that until it was already too late and I couldn't even restart a chapter. Not a great experience. And did I mention that these legendary weapons, extremely powerful artifacts, great for slaying powerful enemies, all have limited uses? And that when you're out of uses, you get the bad ending as well? Yeah, this is like the perfect recipe for disaster, especially on blind first-timers. How were new players in 2002 ever supposed to know that they need to complete a ton of chapters in a certain turn limit to receive powerful weapons and then not use them until they get to chapter 22 where they defeat Zephiel, the main antagonist of the game? Because that's another thing Binding Blade definitely does worse than Mystery. Mystery of the Emblem definitely doesn't tell you got the bad ending, it's shy on hints, but at the very least, I can imagine players who naturally saw it got a sense of something is missing here. It's a very quick, underwhelming and unceremonious ending. But in the Binding Blade, the chapter ending dialogue of the bad ending is longer than the good one, and it also continues with a standard epilogue that describes how things went past Zephiel's defeat. Mystery doesn't do this, because in that timeline, Medeus destroyed the world presumably. But here? Let me just quote you some stuff from the bad ending. Alib began a new golden age of peace and prosperity. The war on the continent of Bern was resolved, and the mysterious Dark Priestess was never seen again. This is barely a bad ending, you could even call this the ending, while the actual ending, with 4 more chapters of gameplay, is some sort of secret bonus ending. After all, even without those 4, the story is done, it has reached its natural conclusion. You just don't learn who the Dark Priestess is, and some of the backstory is lost, but this all works. Its entire purpose, inviting you to replay the game, is lost that way. This ending doesn't invite you to discover the truth at all. It barely hints at more truth existing. So all in all, this is really a complete lost situation. If you don't know you got the bad ending, the game does nothing to make you want to try again. And if you know you got the bad ending, you're much more likely to blame the game's stupid mechanics rather than feel it's your own fault. Within a few games, entries 3 and 6, the series got 2 bad endings, putting it up there as a sort of semi-recurring feature. But ever since the Binding Blade, it went into a deep slumber, and that is almost certainly the result of how poorly the bad ending of the Binding Blade was designed. Bad endings made a semi-revival on the 3DS though, albeit not truly. A big part of Awakening's story is about a bad ending happening in an alternate future, and we get to see this for ourselves too in the Future Past DLC. I would say in terms of truly feeling like a bad ending, Fates did it better though, as while Future Past does very much feel like an alternate future, where not necessarily the same events happen as in the main story, Fate's Heirs of Fate does this in a more distinct way. This especially feels that way because Heirs of Fate only allows you to use your child units, while Future Past teleports your entire army over. Anyway, here the idea is that all parent characters have fallen in the war between Nor and Hoshido, meaning that their children in the Deep Realms have never really fought alongside them and are now left to fend on their own as more mysterious figures attack. As much as I hate the Deep Realms for making absolutely no sense on the best of days, this is an interesting premise to me, I can't lie. And due to the limited roster, it also truly feels like you're playing a bad ending, where the characters you know are nowhere to be found and you're left to your own devices with limited options. That's how a playable bad ending should feel. But obviously, it's not really a bad ending. This is continuing off a bad ending we never saw and don't even know the details of. For a true bad ending and easily the best version of it the series has ever seen, we need to fast forward to Fire Emblem Engage. Because yes, I'm not gonna piss half of you watching off by calling one of the 3 houses endings the bad ending because your favorite house deer doesn't survive. Anyway, in Engage, the bad ending is very well hidden, so much so that I'd wager most of you have only seen it on YouTube, or perhaps even never at all. But it's very simple to get, it doesn't require 12 different items and then failing to get one. All you need to do is die. Die in the final chapter while fighting Sombron. Then you'll get a special cutscene that shows Sombron claiming his victory as Vil has reverted back to her fell form and is now joined by her sibling Alear, who is being summoned as a Dark Emblem. It's a messed up ending if you think about it. All your units are dead at this point, a fact Sombron taunts you with, and Alear's fate is to live forever and ever as an emblem ring in Sombron's possession. And the neat thing is, unlike Mystery and the Binding Blade, the cutscene simply ends with a game over rather than the credits. This way, it becomes a super cool Easter egg rather than a pain in the butt, and I remember actually seeing this live during my first playthrough because, yes, I underestimated Sombron, and thinking, man, why don't more games do this? And I don't just mean Fire Emblem, I mean in general. There are so many games that end with a fight against an all-powerful, world-destroying entity, but if you're defeated, it's usually treated as if you lost during any other fight or level or chapter. But if you win, there's suddenly this grand cutscene and ending. And Fire Emblem Engage, of all titles, went the extra mile and included a special cutscene to show that the world does continue if you die. This is not a video game, this is a story, so if you fail, it ends here. Now try again. For a game that sometimes feels as if it's actively trying not to immerse you, this is some next level immersion and storytelling stuff. I would really like to see this become a staple in not just future Fire Emblem games, but just games in general. But what are your thoughts on these bad endings in the series? Did you see them naturally or learn about them after the fact? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.